Hi, I'm Mr. Baker, and this is today's remote learning lesson on the unit on evolution. 10.5 Shaping Evolutionary Theory. We're going to have you learn how to explain evolutionary mechanisms like non-random mating, coevolution, and mutations, and how these can help account for changes in life forms. Our first major topic is genetic drift. This is any change in an allele frequencies in a population that is due to chance. Chance being your key word there. Hook chance up to genetic drift. One example of this is the founder effect, where a small sample of a population settled in a location separated from the rest of a population, meaning that an uncommon allele can become common. Islands are great examples of this, and we'll come back to this and touch upon the founder effect when we talk more about Darwin and his finches. Another example is a population bottleneck. This is where you have a large population that goes down to a very small number and then rebounds. Here they're showing you that you have a population of looks like yellow and blue marbles, and only a few come out and they're mostly blue, and then when the population rebounds you have mostly blue marbles and only a few yellows. The great example of this is the cheetah. Cheetahs had a population bottleneck about 15,000 years ago. They were down to so few individuals that they are all so genetically similar. You can actually take a skin graft from one cheetah anywhere in the world, because they're in zoos now, and put that skin graft onto another cheetah anywhere else, and it will take. You don't get to do that with humans. We are still very genetic diverse, but cheetahs are not. So they've suffered a population bottleneck. Non-random mating, meaning that the mating is not completely random and that there are choices going on. Some organisms mate with similar organisms to themselves. A great example of this are the snow geese. There is a snow geese, the one in the center left is mostly white, and the one in the bottom right is mostly blue. And it turns out that the blue forms of the snow geese pick blue to mate with, and the white forms pick the white forms to mate with, so they are not mating randomly. Reminder that mutations are a random change in the DNA. If this provides some type of advantage, then it will become more common as it goes through generations, and that is called an adaptation. Big reminder, you, a deer, an individual, does not evolve. You either survive and reproduce or you don't. If you survive and reproduce, then the genes that you have can be passed on to future generations, and if you have an advantage, that can be an adaptation. There are three main types of natural selection I expect you to know. Stabilizing selection. In any population, you might have a bell curve of different forms. In this case, you've got lighter and darker types of butterflies. The environment selects for the more intermediate form, in this case the blue, as opposed to the dark purple and the brighter white. Those get eliminated for whatever reason, and the blues stay behind, and they become the more common form of that species. That's stabilizing selection. Directional selection is when you're going to pick for one extreme or the other. Another example is directional selection, where the extreme version of the trait becomes more common. A great example is the peppered moth out of the Victorian era of the Industrial Revolution in England. They were called peppered because they were mostly light and they had little black flecks all over them, looked like somebody had peppered them. But as pollution became prominent, the darker form, which was the inverse, darker wings with little white specks all over it, became more common. Then as Earth Day and people started to realize that, hey, we're polluting, they cleaned it up, and actually the peppered moth population slowly switched back to being peppered, the light form with the dark splotches. So that's directional. It's when you're going to pick one extreme or the other. Disruptive selection is when you're going to split the two groups. Here we have two types of snakes, a light and a dark, and it looks like the intermediate form didn't make it for whatever reason. So that's disruptive. So the big thing about those three types is that you're going to see a graph, or going to have to explain a graph. And one selects for the middle, one selects for either the right side or the left side, and one selects for both the right and the left side and not the middle. Reproductive isolation is how you keep species from interbreeding. And one way to not waste your genes on another species that's not going to work for you is to keep your egg and sperm from meeting. That's pre-zygotic isolation. Before, zygote, meaning before you get to the zygote stage. Easy way to do that is not to be in the same area. That's geographic. Ecological, you can be in different habitats in the same area. There are examples of snakes that there's a water snake and a land snake, and if they don't meet because one stays really close to the water and the one stays out on the land. And behavioral, the different mating rituals. So if you don't do the right dance, you don't entice anybody to mate with you. Postzygotic isolation is when egg and sperm do meet, but the hybrid offspring cannot reproduce. They're sterile. For example, horse is a species, donkey is a species, but when they mate, you get mules, and mules cannot reproduce. Or do they? There have been isolated examples of mules being able to reproduce, but for our purposes, they can be our example of postzygotic isolation. Speciation is the process by which you get a new species. Animals from two different species can't reproduce, so for that to happen, you've got to have those prezygotic or postzygotic isolation events to occur. There are two types of speciation you need to know. Allopatric, easy, A for allopatric, A for apart. These are apart. They can't get together even if they wanted to. There is a physical barrier. The great example are the Kaibab and the Aber squirrels that got divided by the Grand Canyon, and now even if they wanted to get together, they would have to Evel Knievel over the Grand Canyon to get to each other, and they're squirrels. They don't have that capacity. So that is one example of a physical barrier. Sympatric speciation, S for sympatric, S for same. They are in the same place, and this is one that evolves without some type of physical barrier, and they can occur side by side during this process. Insects and plants are great examples of these. Here's one that should be simple for you. Two different types of trees. They got a river cut through them. Pollen can't get across because it's too wide, and you get a new species on one side, the old species, the ancestrals on the other. With sympatric, you have a new species that just appears through some mechanisms right in the middle, and those mechanisms are beyond the breadth of this course. Adaptive radiation is an example of where one species gives rise to many species. Islands are great examples of this, and Darwin finches are perhaps the most famous form. So let's talk about Darwin and his finches. You have one small group of ancestral seed-eating ground finches that got to the Galapagos because they got blown off course. Who knows how? And then they evolved into this 13 different finch species that look like other examples of birds, but they're actually all DNA related ancestrally to the first finch species that got to the Galapagos. That is adaptive radiation, and it's also to tie in the founder effect. Had it not been finches that got here, it could have been, I don't know, I'll just make up something, blue jays. And then you would have a whole adaptive radiation of things that were sort of similar to blue jays, but not. But you need to remember Darwin and his finches. Coevolution is where two species are so intertwined that one can't exist without the other. For example, this is a picture of a moth, and that moth has a special tongue that only works on that particular type, and I believe that's an orchid. You take the moth away, the orchid doesn't get to fertilize, the orchid goes away. If you take the orchid away, the moth doesn't get food, and so that moth is going to have issues. Or maybe that's a fly of some type. It's an insect. We'll roll with that. Parasites are also other great examples. They are so intertwined with their hosts that if you take their host away, the parasite goes away. And we did the insects and flowers. Convergent evolution is unrelated species evolve similar traits, even though they have no connections. Like the genes just got together and mixed it up and gave them an advantage that was the same in two different species that show no real ancestry together. For example, fingerprints. If you're going to do a crime, do it in Australia in a koala patch, because koalas have fingerprints that are remarkably similar to humans. There's a picture there with the human on the right and the koala on the left, and they are hard to tell apart. Why? Why did they get those? Good question, you ask. Probably because both humans and koalas needed to grasp things, and the fingerprints provide a little edge for friction so you can more easily grasp. In the case of the koalas, pulling branches closer to them so they could eat the eucalyptus leaves, and for humans, for various things that we were grasping as well as our ape ancestors were evolving. Speciation is always happening. Evolution is always occurring. It may take hundreds or millions of years, depending upon where it is and how the environment is affecting those individuals in this population. There are two types of speciation that you need to know. Gradualism, which evolution occurs in small gradual steps, hence gradualism, and another one called punctuated equilibrium, where you have rapid spurts of genetic change that causes species to diverge quickly. A great example of punctuated equilibrium is when the meteor hit and wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. You had a crazy amount of evolution going on because the dinosaurs were gone, and so all the mammals just went kind of crazy. And then once they got established, then things slowed down because all of the resources were being used. In any event, gradualism, long and slow, small steps. Punctuated equilibrium, short, rapid bursts. Your quiz will be coming up and will include genetic drift, population bottleneck, non-random mating, mutations, the 3 types of natural selection, and graphs. I might even throw a picture in there for you. The types of reproductive isolation, speciation, allopatrics apart, sympatric is in the same area. Adaptive radiation, don't forget the founder effect, and Darwin's and its finches, coevolution and convergent evolution, and how fast it goes, gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. All right, study hard for your quiz, and we will see you next time.